When my hand extended toward him, his eyes dropped to it, then back to my face. "I don't shake hands with staff," he said, loud enough for everyone nearby to hear. A few laughed softly, unsure if it was a joke. It wasn't. His attention had already moved on, dismissing me as though I were nothing more than a piece of furniture in that expensive conference hall. I pulled my hand back slowly. The air between us seemed to thicken, not with embarrassment, but with the quiet knowledge that something had shifted. He didn't know it yet, but that single sentence had set something in motion that couldn't be stopped. He kept talking to others, not realizing the room was watching, assessing. Not realizing the person he had just insulted was holding more power over his future than anyone else there. Within minutes, he would start to notice the small changes. People checking their phones, conversations cutting short, the faint edge of unease spreading across his own team's faces. And then, before the day was over, the thing he valued most, more than the deal, more than the press, more than his image, would be gone. If you're new here, make sure you subscribe to Echoes of Hope Stories HQ for more gripping, true human stories. And let me know in the comments what country you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. 15 years in the high-stakes world of corporate mergers had taught her two things. Every word carries weight, and not everyone wants you at the table. As a negotiator, she'd handled billion-dollar agreements between industries most people never even saw from the outside. Energy, finance, technology, walking into boardrooms where power hummed in the air and everyone wore their confidence like armor. She had earned her place in those rooms. Degrees from the best schools, a record of closing deals others called impossible, and a reputation for turning tense talks into signed contracts without losing her composure. But none of that shielded her from the moments that came purely because of who she was. A black woman in spaces that still expected her to be silent, grateful, and invisible. From the beginning, she had learned to read the room faster than anyone else. The men who looked past her to speak to a male junior associate. The handshakes that grew firmer when they realized she wasn't just an assistant. The comments meant to sound like compliments but laced with condescension. "You're very articulate," or "You carry yourself well." Those moments didn't harden her. They refined her. And now she was holding the pen on one of the largest deals her company had ever pursued. A $10 billion acquisition that would expand their reach into new markets across 3 continents. The stakes weren't just high, they were towering. Months of work had brought her to this final stage, where all that was left was securing the personal sign-off from the man whose company was on the other side of the table. Her team knew the details inside out. Contracts, valuations, market projections, every number had been checked, double-checked, and presented in a way that left no room for doubt. But beyond the spreadsheets and legal clauses, there was something more fragile in play. The trust and mutual respect between the two companies' leadership. That trust would take just seconds to fracture. Because while she was ready to talk terms, ready to close the deal, she hadn't yet met the man himself. And when she did, it wouldn't be the negotiation she remembered, it would be the moment that changed everything. The conference hall smelled faintly of fresh polish and expensive coffee, subtle signals of money well spent to impress important guests. Tall glass windows framed the city skyline, and every detail of the room seemed designed to project success. Leather chairs, glossy mahogany tables, bottled water with labels in a foreign language. Danielle arrived early, as always. It wasn't about punctuality, it was about presence. Being in the room before anyone else meant she could set the tone, greet allies, and read the energy before the real negotiations began. Members of his team trickled in, sharply dressed, offering professional smiles and handshakes that felt more like ritual than warmth. They knew who she was. Some even glanced at her with quiet recognition, aware of her reputation in the industry. But still, a few seemed to hold back, as if trying to decide whether she was the person in charge or just another senior staffer sent to smooth the edges before the real conversation began. The agenda was straightforward: finalize the terms, address last-minute legal points, and secure both signatures. Her company had already extended every professional courtesy: private jet transport for his executives, top-tier accommodations, even a gourmet dinner the night before. Now, all that was left was to shake hands and seal the deal. But the man at the center of it all was missing. When the double doors finally swung open, the atmosphere shifted. He walked in with slow, deliberate steps, his tailored suit cut to perfection, his watch catching the light like it was meant to be noticed. He didn't glance around to take in the room took in him. Conversations faltered, chairs adjusted, aides straightened their backs. Danielle rose, extending her hand with the same professional courtesy she had shown 1,000 times before. He stopped just short of taking it, his eyes scanning her face as though assessing a minor detail on a report he'd already decided to ignore. Then came the smirk, small, sharp, and loaded. "I don't shake hands with staff," he said, his voice steady, each word designed to land. For a moment, the only sound was the faint shuffle of papers somewhere near the end of the table. One of his aides shifted uncomfortably. Another's lips twitched as if fighting back a reaction. Danielle withdrew her hand without flinching. Her expression didn't change, her eyes didn't waver. Years in boardrooms had taught her that the first one to break composure loses more than pride. They lose control. "Shall we begin?" she asked evenly, her voice carrying just enough to fill the space between them. He sat down without responding, turning his attention to the man seated beside her, as if she were merely an observer. The slight was deliberate, the message clear. In his mind, her presence was optional. What he didn't know, what he couldn't have guessed, was that the person he had just dismissed as staff was holding the authority to sign or sink the entire $10 billion deal. And before the day was over, he was going to find out exactly what that meant. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you stand for respect over revenue, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. The more we share these stories, the fewer rooms there will be where silence is mistaken for agreement. The meeting began with a review of the financial projections. Danielle had prepared the materials herself, clear, precise, impossible to dispute. Yet every time she spoke, the CEO's eyes would drift past her, settling on the man seated to her right. "Now, walk me through the revenue split again," he said, addressing her colleague directly. Her colleague glanced at her, hesitating, before repeating the exact numbers she had just presented. The CEO nodded, as if the explanation made more sense coming from him. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't an oversight. It was a choice. Midway through the presentation, he leaned back in his chair, wearing the look of a man who believed the room and the deal belonged to him. "I've always said partnerships like this work best when we can align on image," he remarked, his tone dipping into something casual but edged. "We've made some efforts in recent years to modernize. Diversity hires, representation, keeping up appearances for the market." The words were framed as business strategy, but they landed like a slap. He wasn't just ignoring her. He was stripping away her expertise, reducing her presence to a box checked for optics. Danielle's pen rested against her notepad, motionless. She let the silence hang, long enough for a few people to shift uncomfortably in their seats. Inside, her thoughts were sharp, steady. This isn't the first time, but it might be the last time. With him. She'd been in rooms where her ideas were lifted and repackaged by others, where her achievements were met with surprise instead of respect. But here, in this high-profile meeting, in front of his entire leadership team, the insult was open, public, and deliberate. She noticed the subtle tells. One aide kept their eyes on the table, flipping through pages without reading them. Another took a sudden interest in their phone. The man beside her cleared his throat softly before continuing, his voice quieter than before. No one spoke up. No one challenged the remark. The absence of pushback was its own kind of statement, a silent agreement that his behavior, however uncomfortable, was to be tolerated. Danielle's face gave nothing away. She had learned long ago that the most dangerous weapon in a room like this wasn't outrage. It was composure. Outrage burned fast and bright. Composure lingered, waiting for the right moment to strike. The CEO continued, sliding casually into a discussion about image synergy and market appeal, never once looking her in the eye. She let him talk, nodding when appropriate, but each word he spoke only cemented the decision forming quietly in her mind. There was a way to respond to this, a way that didn't involve raising her voice or trading insults. And if she did it right, he would remember this meeting for the rest of his career. For now, she let him think he was leading, because the most devastating power move was the one he wouldn't see coming. The meeting rolled on, charts flipping across the large screen, legal language flowing in a steady rhythm. Danielle sat perfectly still, eyes forward, nodding at key points. On the surface, she appeared to be tracking every slide, absorbing every figure. But inside, her mind was replaying his words, each one as sharp as when they first landed. I don't shake hands with staff. Diversity hires, keeping up appearances. She'd endured these moments before, but something about this one felt different. This wasn't a passing slight in a hallway or an offhand remark behind closed doors. This was public, deliberate, and aimed directly at her credibility in the very room where she was supposed to lead. She reached for her phone, not with haste, but with the kind of casual movement no one would notice in a room where half the attendees were glancing at their own devices. A quick tap opened her secure corporate messaging app, one she used only for confidential exchanges with the company's executive board. Her thumbs moved swiftly under the table, the message short and clear. Pause all finalization steps on the merger. Do not proceed without my confirmation. Urgent. No context. No explanation. Just an instruction. The app confirmed the message had been received and opened by the chair of the board. Danielle slipped the phone face down on the table, her expression unchanged. Across from her, the CEO was leaning toward her male colleague again, discussing next phases as though the ink on the deal were already dry. He was speaking about future expansions, brand alignments, and how their combined presence in the market would dominate on every level. His tone was triumphant, the kind of victory lap taken before the finish line. Danielle let him talk. Every so often she made a note on her pad, numbers, phrases, the occasional checkmark. None of it was for her own records, it was for appearance. The truth was, she was already in a different part of the game, one he hadn't even realized they were playing. She glanced at his team. The same aides who'd looked away earlier still avoided her eyes. One of them fiddled with a pen, tapping it against a folder in a restless pattern. Another had their jaw clenched tight, as if bracing for something they couldn't yet name. Her own team remained quiet, letting her lead without interruption. They knew her well enough to recognize that stillness didn't mean passivity. It meant precision timing. As the CEO concluded a lengthy point about optics and market trust, Danielle offered a polite smile. "That's certainly one perspective," she said softly, and he nodded, mistaking her even tone for agreement. He didn't know the pause was already in motion. He didn't know that before the day ended, the entire trajectory of his company's future would shift. And that the shift had begun in silence, with a single encrypted message sent from the other side of the table. The meeting broke with polite applause and the scraping of chairs against the floor. Contracts were neatly stacked, pens tucked away, and the CEO left the room with the air of a man who believed everything had gone according to plan. His laugh carried faintly down the hallway as he exchanged remarks with his aides, still oblivious to what had just shifted beneath his feet. Danielle gathered her folder, thanked her team quietly, and stepped into the bright midday air. The hotel's courtyard was lined with marble columns and trimmed hedges, but she barely noticed the setting. She needed space, distance from the room, and just enough quiet to make the call that would decide everything. Her phone was already in hand when she reached the edge of the property. She dialed the direct number for the chair of her company's board. "Status?" the chair asked, brisk and expecting good news. "It's not moving forward," Danielle said evenly. "Not under his leadership." There was a pause, the kind that signaled the weight of her words had landed. "Explain." She laid it out without embellishment. The public dismissal, the refusal to shake her hand, the comment about diversity hires and keeping up appearances. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The insult wasn't just personal. It was an open declaration of how he viewed partnership, leadership, and respect. "This isn't about a missed handshake," she continued. "It's about the fact that respect is the foundation of a deal we make. If he treats me this way in a room full of people when we're about to sign a $10 billion agreement, imagine how he'll treat the partnership when the spotlight's off." The chair was silent for a moment longer. "Understood," they finally said. "You have full backing to make the call." Danielle exhaled slowly, not in relief, but in resolve. "Then we're done here. Do you want to issue the statement, or should we?" "I'll handle it," she replied. And for the record, her voice remained calm, steady, deliberate. "We don't work with men who think respect is optional." When the call ended, she stood for a moment, watching the traffic pass on the street beyond the hotel gates. Somewhere inside, the CEO was probably toasting what he thought was a victory. She didn't feel the need to correct him, yet. The correction would come soon enough, in a form he couldn't ignore. A public announcement, a deal erased, and shareholders asking questions he wouldn't be able to answer without admitting the truth. She turned back toward the building, walking with the same composed stride she'd had all morning. But now, each step carried the knowledge that she'd just shifted the outcome entirely. The meeting he thought he'd won had only been the opening scene. By the time Danielle reached her office, the official statement was already drafted. The language was direct and businesslike, leaving no ambiguity about the decision. "Following a review of the terms and alignment of leadership values, our company will not be moving forward with the proposed merger." It went out at 3:17 p.m. Within minutes, the first financial outlet picked it up. By the top of the hour, 3 major business networks had interrupted programming to discuss the sudden collapse of one of the year's biggest deals. Anchors speculated on what could have caused a $10 billion agreement to evaporate at the final stage. Some analysts blamed market volatility. Others guessed at hidden legal disputes. By 4 p.m., the stock price of the CEO's company was down nearly 8%. At 4:23, a prominent investment columnist posted on social media, "Sources say the deal fell apart over more than numbers. Values were at stake." That single post opened the door for questions the CEO had no interest in answering. Inside his circle, the mood shifted from confident disbelief to thinly veiled panic. Senior executives traded urgent calls, legal counsel was pulled into back-to-back meetings, and investor relations scrambled to calm the largest shareholders. Danielle, meanwhile, kept working at her desk. Calls came in from contacts across the industry, some simply curious, others offering quiet support. She took only the most necessary ones, listening more than speaking. The less she said publicly, the more space there was for the truth to find its own way out. And it did. By early evening, 2 journalists with strong corporate connections had the same story. Multiple witnesses in the meeting confirmed that the CEO had refused to shake Danielle's hand and referred to her as staff, before making remarks about diversity hires and keeping up appearances. The details spread quickly, each outlet citing unnamed but credible sources from within his own company. By the 10 p.m. news cycle, the narrative was no longer about a mysterious business collapse. It was about racism at the highest levels of corporate leadership. Viewers weren't just seeing numbers on a screen. They were hearing about the human insult that had set the chain reaction in motion. The CEO issued a brief statement the next morning, calling the reports mischaracterizations and insisting the decision to withdraw had been mutual. But even as he spoke, the markets disagreed. His company's valuation had dropped by more than $1.4 billion in less than 24 hours. Danielle didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Watching from her office window as the city moved on below, she knew the real impact of the decision went beyond the money. For once, the story wasn't buried under corporate jargon or legal settlements. It was out in the open, and people were paying attention. This time, silence hadn't been the safest option. Action had. The headlines would fade eventually. Another scandal would take their place. Another corporate drama would pull the public's attention. Danielle knew that. What concerned her was the space between these stories, the thousands of moments that never reached a camera or a reporter's desk. In the boardroom, discrimination rarely announced itself in slurs or shouting. It came dressed in professional preferences, in comments about cultural fit, in decisions made in closed rooms where merit was weighed differently, depending on who was in front of the table. It slipped past HR policies and diversity statements because it could always be explained away as business judgment. She thought of the people without $10 billion leverage in their hands. The administrative assistant overlooked for promotion because clients respond better to someone else. The mid-level manager whose ideas were passed over until repeated by someone with lighter skin. The entry-level hire with a degree and experience, still told to prove themselves more than peers. For them, there was no press release, no market collapse, no shareholder outrage. There was just the quiet erosion of dignity, the choice to stay silent to keep a paycheck, the gnawing thought that speaking up might end a career before it started. She remembered a study she'd read the year before. Only 4% of executive positions in Fortune 500 companies were held by Black professionals. For Black women, the number was even smaller, less than 2%. Those weren't just numbers. They were a reflection of the narrow doorways still guarding the path to leadership. In high-stakes business, silence had a cost. Every unchecked slight made the next one easier to excuse. Every ignored insult set the stage for a bigger one down the line. And when the insult came from the very top, it didn't just target one person. It sent a signal to the entire organization about whose respect was negotiable. Danielle knew she'd been able to push back because she had the authority, the reputation, and the support of a board that trusted her judgment. But that didn't make the insult any less telling. If this was how he treated a potential partner who could affect his bottom line, how did he treat the people whose livelihoods depended on him? The bigger picture wasn't just about one CEO losing a deal. It was about an entire system that allowed him to think he could speak that way without consequence. This time, there had been a consequence. The story stayed in the headlines longer than Danielle expected, not because of the money, though $10 billion made for an irresistible headline, but because of what people learned about why the deal collapsed. For weeks, her inbox filled with interview requests, invitations to speak at conferences, and op-eds debating whether values had a place in high-stakes business. Danielle didn't accept most of them. She'd said what needed to be said in the boardroom and in the decisions she made. But she also knew there was an opportunity here, not for more publicity, but for impact. She met with a small circle of trusted colleagues, women and men who understood the barriers she'd faced, and outlined an idea. A leadership program specifically for young Black women entering corporate negotiations. Not a networking event, not a token mentorship scheme. A structured, funded initiative that would train them in deal strategy, teach them how to recognize subtle bias in business settings, and give them the tools to push back without jeopardizing their position. The funding came quietly, with no press release attached. She partnered with a university business school and a handful of companies willing to provide real-world negotiation scenarios. Within months, the first cohort began. 12 women, each with a story that mirrored some part of her own. When the media eventually learned about it, they called her a deal breaker with principles, a label that made her smile. She wasn't chasing a title. She was building something that could outlast the headlines. The messages from strangers were the part she hadn't anticipated. Hundreds of them, from across the country and abroad. Some were short, "Thank you for standing firm." Others were long, deeply personal accounts of being overlooked, dismissed, or spoken over in their own workplaces. One email came from a young woman in her first year at a law firm. "I've been afraid to speak up since my first day. Watching what you did made me feel like I'm not crazy for wanting respect." Danielle read every message. She didn't respond to all. There were too many. But she kept them. They were a reminder that what happened in that conference room wasn't just about her or the CEO. It was part of a larger fight for dignity in spaces that still questioned who deserved to be there. And for the first time in a long time, she felt like she'd moved the needle. Maybe not enough to change the whole system, but enough for someone else to walk into their next meeting a little taller. He thought my hand wasn't worth taking. Turns out it was holding the pen that could erase his future. It wasn't about pride. It wasn't about showing who could speak louder or stand taller. It was about a simple truth. If respect isn't present at the table, the deal isn't worth signing. In business, people like to talk about risk and reward, about the numbers that can make or break a quarter. But there's another kind of risk. The risk of letting someone believe that their disregard for you is acceptable. That kind of risk spreads quietly, shaping the way they treat not just you, but everyone who comes after you. Walking away from $10 billion wasn't an easy call, but it was the right one. And for every message, every email, every story from people who said they'd been through the same thing, it became even clearer that the money was never the real measure of success. The real measure is how you leave the room. Some people leave with signed contracts, others leave with their dignity. On rare days, you can choose both. And on that day, I chose the one that couldn't be taken back, diluted, or quietly erased in the next quarterly report. This is for the ones who've kept their voices steady in rooms where they weren't welcome. For the ones who've stayed silent because they had to, and for those who've spoken because they couldn't stay quiet any longer. Dignity isn't loud, but it's unforgettable. If you've ever had to choose between your dignity and your paycheck, I want to hear your story. Tell me where you're watching from, and if you stand for respect over revenue, subscribe to Echoes of Hope. The more we share these stories, the fewer rooms there will be where silence is mistaken for agreement. Because in the end, deals come and go. But the people who stand their ground change the game forever.